You're good to go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is John Malloy, and I am a principal designer for Newell Brands. I want to welcome you all to the Adult Coloring 201 class. This is my second demonstration in coloring using Prismacolor markers and colored pencils. If you're interested, you can check out the 201 class, which is similar to this. I mean, we're going to go through different tips and tricks. You don't necessarily need to have seen that to do this or vice versa. But this is just a further continuation and additional skill sets. Um, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a principal designer and illustrator for Newell, makers of Sharpie, all things Sharpie, Papermate, Prismacolor, obviously, and Elmer's. And I do a lot of work for them, but I also am a freelance illustrator and fine artist. I go by the name of Flux, and I do stuff for Apple and FX and Focus Features. I'm also a painter, and I show in galleries internationally. But I've always done colored pencil and marker work since college, and I love it. So I'm really excited to share some of the techniques here today. Um, and I'd love to see your stuff. If you take this and finish it and want to share it online, that's great. I put together a little cheat sheet here of hashtags and um, at symbols so that you can, I mean, I think they're going to put them in the chat too, but you can connect those. You can either call out at Prismacolor, Newell Design, which is just Newell's Design Hub. This is my handle for all of these. And then we have these hashtags, make it with Michael's or Michael's classes. Be great. So I guess that's it. I move on to getting started a little bit. If you want to switch screens. So this is the page we're going to be coloring today. And I know they have a link to it where you can actually download it. You can print it out on any kind of paper, even just regular printer paper is fine. But I would suggest that if you have a decent printer and you want to, print out coloring pages and make them really nice, you can use a cardstock and print that from your printer. Just, like 110 pound would be great. But again, you can use any kind of paper. It's fine. So this is an actual sheet, and I printed it out 8.5 by 11, or a little bit larger, so I have some margin. The actual thing itself is 8.5 by 11, and I wanted to show everybody what it looks like when it's finished being colored. I'm going to go through just some spots here. I'm not going to be able to get through the whole thing during the class, but at least you can see just the techniques that I'm going to go through and different things you can do. This is obviously a little different from other coloring pages you may have seen where there's actually a lot of space in here. And the reason being is I want to show you some tips on how to use these markers almost like paintbrushes. And the markers we're going to use are Prismacolor Premier. That's better. And they have a really nice brush tip on the larger side. So you can get different brushy effects, especially if you're doing something like that's an animal that has fur and you want to get that kind of technique down. It comes in handy. So just to kind of go over this is all done with Prismacolor Premier markers, the ears, anything that had the main fur. But for the hair or the mane, I used the Prismacolor colored pencils, and I'll go through that too. I'll start with the markers and move on to that. But the nose and the eyes I did with colored pencil too. So the one thing about markers is they're always going to be a little bit darker than your colored pencils if you wanted to use both in a piece. So just to keep that in mind, that kind of helps me give a glow to the eyes and a little bit of a lighter tone to the nose using the colored pencils as opposed to markers. Let's see. And then I guess that I'll just move on to the marker part. Again, please feel free to post even as you're going, or if you want to, show some of your work at the end of this, we'd love to see it. But the two markers that I'm going to use right now are Goldenrod and Spanish Orange. For those of you that don't have these colors, or if you have a different set, feel free to use any colors you like. I would just suggest that you have sort of a darker and lighter shade of the same color. That'll really help keep this solidified. You know, where here I have this sort of a darker orange and a lighter orange. If you mix colors, it can get a little wonky. Um, so yeah, I would just suggest getting using a set of markers that are similar in shade. But I'll start with the lighter one and use the whiter side that looks almost like a paintbrush tip. And start from the edges and kind of work my way in. You'll notice, and just go lightly at first, kind of get it in there. You can press hard and get a wider coverage with this brush tip, but if you go lightly, you can get a little finer detail. You can get fine detail with the other side also, but it's a little, it comes out looking more streakish, like you have more lines in the work, so it's a little harder to control that. But if you notice,
hey, John, really quickly.
I'm sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to call out for the people in the chat. I know some of you had some issues with the original sheet that was printed out. I just uploaded the file to the coloring page in the chat. So if you guys use that to download and print out, you should have the full line.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So I'm just going to kind of do a little bit here and down to the bottom of the lion's face where we're going to add a little shading. But, you know, don't worry about it if you're overlapping. That is an inevitability. But if you notice, the direction I'm going in kind of follows where the fur would go, because it's leaving these streaks that you can actually use as like a texture. And I'm basically going over everything. The nice thing about, you know, coloring over line work with these markers is you don't have to worry about losing any of the line work. It stays there. So that comes in handy. I know the last class I did some pastel, and it tends to really, you know, bleach out the lines, and you can always go back and draw over those lines with just a regular pen. But in this case, we're just using markers and color pencils, and that way you won't have to do that. I'm just going to finish here around the eye and down the side of the nose. Again, just kind of going lightly when I get close to edges that I don't want it to bleed over, and following the direction of where the fur would go here. And when I drew this line art, I specifically kept these areas onto the left and right of the nose for shading specifically, so that we can actually use these little shapes as a guide on where to put shadows and that sort of thing. All right, so I'm getting a little more coverage just by pressing harder, sweeping across here. Okay, so you'll notice there's some streaks in here. The great thing about these two is that you can build up and get darker and darker, as dark as you want to get, you know, as saturated as it will get, I should say. So if I'm around next to the edge of the face and the face is coming out, there's going to be shadows on the sides of the face going back. So I'm just going to put a little shadow there, using the same marker itself. And then the same down here. And again, just kind of following the direction, because I'm basically using the streaks to support, you know, a texture where it looks like it's the lion's face. So, and that's just with basically, I mean, if you think of it like coats of paint, that's like 2 coats, right? We could still go even a little bit darker and keep going and going until, you know, you get it as dark as you want to. but I want to introduce the other color, and then we'll actually come back and put this color on top of that color, and I'll explain why once I get there. So this at least gives you an idea of how you can really just build up using the same color. You know, obviously when you have something that's completely filled out like these lines, you're just going to fill them in with your marker and not necessarily be concerned with this. But this is a technique you can use outside of just a coloring page. You know, you could try it with something else. You know, if you draw something simple with pencil and then go back in and color it using these and actually build up your shading with these markers. All right. So this one, this is the goldenrod. The one thing I will say too about these Prismacolor markers is although I think these are very close, the colors that are on the markers themselves, they can be a little misleading. So just, you know, if you want to test out the color itself in your margins to see what it looks like. So if you see that's pretty light on the pen, but dark on the paper. It all depends too on whatever surface you're working with. But this is the larger end, the larger tip. And then essentially, just kind of looking at this, I'm going to shade in this area around the eyes and on the side. And again, here, it's nice because you can go lightly at your edges. You want to do it this way. And honestly, like if, you know, you're doing this and a little gets over, don't worry. I mean, especially here, because honestly, this whole thing would be orange and you wouldn't have to worry about it so much anyway. And sometimes things like that can be happy accidents and you can somehow make it work. All right, so again, here I'm going to start from the inside and go outward, kind of like what I was doing with the orange color. Just to give it a little bit more depth. So another thing you might notice too is that sometimes these colors can dry a little bit lighter than when you put them down. And it's just the nature of the ink. When it's wet, it can look really dark. But once it dries, it can dry a little bit lighter. So just be aware of that. And then what's kind of cool too is once that dries, you know, depending on what colors you use, this is a little bit of a cooler tone. You can go back with your warmer tone, which was my Spanish orange, and kind of go over that also and sort of make it a little bit more reddish in color.
Hey, John, we had someone ask if you have any experience adding water on top of the marker streaks to make it act kind of like a watercolor.
So I have not tried that myself, but I don't know how well that would work. I think probably right after you do it, it would work well. But once it dries, it might be hard to spread it out. Also, you would need some kind of thicker paper because it could really put a hole in the paper if you do it that way. That would be my watch out. But I've never tried it with these. But now I want to, for sure. All right, so I've got that shading in there. The other thing that I wanted to show you too is, you know, a really creative way to kind of beef up your line work is to actually color the line work too. So I'm going to put this up close so you can see. If you go over the lines themselves with a little bit of color, it just really helps bring it out and kind of gives it a more layered look. So in this case, I will go with the finer tip and just go over these. So you can see it just adds a little bit more depth to it. And then even these lines too, as they're coming out onto the lighter color. And if you want to add your own shading, like, okay, you want to put more shadow underneath this eye or something like that, feel free to use the color also. All right. So now I'm going to move on to the color pencils, and maybe we might come back to this if we have a little bit more time later on. But the set that I'm using here is the botanical set. Sorry. But not the whole set. So I have a few that I pulled out that I'll go through individually. But essentially, I'm just using these to color the hair, the eyes, and the nose, just to help, bring them out a little bit because they are lighter in color. So I'm going to start with the eye. And one thing I want to point out with the color pencils, obviously, is to keep a sharpener nearby. I've got an electric, sharpener to keep your tip fairly sharp. One watch out is if you go really sharp, it could easily break and snap. But I recommend just kind of going lightly. Like my kids, they don't, and they break them all the time. So, just to be careful when you're going in with these color pencils, to go really lightly at first until you see how dark you want something to be. And in the same way that I did this shading here, I'm going to do something with the eye as well, but just color a little bit lightly over it, just to get some color in there. But with eyes, there's always a shadow underneath the eye, the top of the eye. And that goes for people too, obviously, or any other animal. So I'm going to go a little bit darker just there.
Hi, John. Really quickly, what color blue are you using?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, this is the the non-photo blue, which comes with the set itself. But honestly, any blue will do. I grabbed this one because it's a very bright blue, and it really pops out. And I'll do both eyes just to continue with this. With color pencils, one of the big differences, obviously, between the two is that you're not going to see a ton of streaks when you're going lightly. You can easily just fill a space up just by lightly scrubbing in any direction, and you won't really see the lines. If you go a little darker, obviously, you're going to see that sort of thing. And again, it is lightening up the line work a little bit, but if that's a personal preference, I'm okay with that. But if you feel like you want that line work to pop again, just go back with a pen and redraw over it. So for the nose, I've got pink rose and rose. And again, you can use whatever you want, obviously. But I would recommend just keeping them within the same family of colors. So each piece, each part of the drawing you're coloring really pops out and is individual in its own way. So again, I'm going to go lightly here with the lighter pink. And if you notice, I'm sort of following the form a little bit. You're not really seeing the lines yet, but you can shade that way, which is kind of cool. And think about where the shadows would be on the nose. They would be like along the edges, at the bottom, that sort of thing. And most of the time when you're thinking about shadows and highlights on things, the highlight is generally at the top, and the shadow is at the bottom. I know that might be common sense for some people, but I know sometimes I get confused by it also. So with the darker rows, I'm going to go in and put a little bit of a darker color in here for the bottom. All right, so now we've got the nose down, the eyes, and I'll do a little on the hair. So with this, I basically used 3 different colors for the mane. The first one is lemon yellow. The second, pale vermilion, and the third, pomegranate. So you can use whatever you like. Again, I use the traditional lion colors. If you want to make a blue lion, that's awesome. Or a purple lion, that's really cool. Just for all intents and purposes here, you know, again, as long as they're in the same family, I think they work really well. So if you had different shades of blues and purples, if you look up a color wheel online, you can kind of see where these colors transition into each other. So, you know, anything in that sort of cooler blue purple, you know, if they're together, or if it's warmer colors, those colors stay together. They work really well together. But I think mixing the two, a lot of times if you mix a cool and a warm color, you can get sort of muddy brown. So definitely you want to keep them within the same family. So this one, I'm going to go in and start coloring this in. And I'm not worried about the lines. You probably can't even see it here on screen, but like up close, I can see that it's putting a little bit of a haze on the line work, but it's really not that noticeable. And the one thing with lighter colors to be careful of too is to really get up close and look at it and make sure that you've covered everything. You know, because depending on your lighting situation, if you put in another light, you could see like you may have left a spot white, which is fine. But if you really want to get full coverage, I would just recommend really kind of zeroing in and making sure that you're getting a full fill of color in there. Looks like I got a spot of orange on the hair there. And there are other sets of, you know, colored pencils you can get. This is just the botanical, and I tend to like it because there's a nice mix of light and dark colors in there. Um, but you know, obviously there are skin tone ones. There are many different sets out there you can try. All right, so I've got a good section of the hair colored in with the yellow. Um, here too, because I want to get some shadows in there. All right. So now I'll move on to pale vermilion. It's almost like a pinkish orange. And starting with, so this is a little bit of a non-traditional way to do shading. And it's something I like to do in my work, but like, obviously there are different ways you can do it. I'm gonna show both. I'm gonna show what would be considered a traditional shading. If I go in like this, you go in like this and just go lightly, you know, starting from the part that would be most in shadow. So like, for instance, this hair is on top of this hair. The darkest part of the shadow is going to be right underneath, and then it's going to get lighter as it goes out. So this would be, I would consider this traditional shading. just going in fully and not worrying about detail or that sort of thing. And then going in darker, even darker as you get closer in.
Hey, John, we had a quick question, actually
Yeah.
a two-part question from somebody. They asked, what's your favorite part about coloring and what's your favorite color to color with?
Oh man, actually, my favorite color is orange. I love coloring with orange, which is probably why I picked these colors. And what was the first part of the question? Sorry.
They said, what's your favorite part about coloring?
Part about it, I think it's nice. It's meditative. It's still work, but it's fun work. It's like a release, and I honestly just love getting lost in something for a long amount of time, and then at the end going, wow, that's cool. I like how that turned out. But just getting lost in it, I feel like there's a certain level of detachment sometimes. You just kind of like forget about everything that's going on around, especially in the world or whatever. And also, there's a little bit of a loss of ego there too. You forget basically the things that kind of bog you down, which is what I like about it. So that is the traditional shading. Yeah, I actually am wearing orange sneakers right now because I love orange. I have an unhealthy love of orange. All right. So I'm going to sharpen this a little bit more. Going to the non-traditional shading. So since these are strands of hair, one thing that you can do is just kind of go lightly inside this color, this shape, rather than doing that traditional fill. It's almost as if this hair on top of this hair is leaving a shadow underneath. So this is something I do a lot in my own personal work. I think it has a nice effect. And it's kind of modern.
John, we had another question. We actually have two more questions for you. Somebody asked, do you have a favorite picture or something that you've colored? I'm sure it's hard to choose.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh man, I really don't know. That's a really tough question. I have a lot of favorites. One of my favorite things that I worked on was a long time ago. Was a brand called Peace Tea, and I did all of that originally by hand, and then eventually, digitally. But the colors that we were able to get, it was amazing. I've never seen. So I work for Newell, and we work with products and things, and a lot of times we're limited by color schemes and what can be printed. But it was really cool to actually see what I had done get printed the same way on an aluminum can. And there are even some colors that I feel like you can get in real life that you can't get digitally, and vice versa. So it's a hard one. I work in both media. I work in digital and traditional, but I don't know if there's a favorite overall. I also feel like every time I get to draw and color something, it's an opportunity to try something new, and that will be my favorite, like while I'm working on it, if that makes any sense. All right.
And then we had somebody ask how you got into drawing and coloring and designing.
So I have been doing it since I was really young. I started drawing probably when I was about 6. I would do cartoons and things like that. And then when I got into high school, I was doing like more realistic portraits of like pop stars and stuff like that. And then I got into comic books. And so I went to a community college. I had I got a great education there. And I had a teacher. One was like one of the world's preeminent trompe l'oeil painters, which is an oil painting technique. And then an illustrator who worked for TV Guide for a few years in the 60s. So I got a really good education, and then really just kind of tried to mimic the work that I really liked, and then became sort of self-taught beyond that. So, and this this technique that I'm showing you right now kind of came out of something where I was like, I want to create something new, a new style that no one has done before. And that's how this came about. So if you see now what I'm doing with this strand of hair, I'm just putting a little bit of a darker color in there, not through the whole thing, but it makes it look like there's a shadow underneath it. Same here. So this is two techniques that you can try that, you know, depending on what you like, might work better than the other. And then, of course, you can go in and almost fill it all the way. And, you know, similar to the markers, obviously, if you go back over, you're going to get a darker tone. But there's more of a stop with the color pencils where it just gets to a point you can't really go much darker than that, which is why I picked that other color, the pomegranate color, to add even a little bit more depth. All right. So this is the pomegranate. And this one I'm going to use, excuse me, even closer into the face. So you can see it kind of makes the shadow darker. You can use any dark color, but the one reason I'm using red is because I want the purity of these colors to really pop. If I were to go in with a black or you know, a blue or something like that, it would take away from the orange. It would kind of just look a little bit muddy. But I think if you know, stick with a warm color scheme or a cool color scheme, you really can't go wrong. So these are all warm colors. And for any of you that aren't familiar with the difference, warm colors are ones that more evoke like a heat, you know, you think of fire, that kind of thing. Cooler colors are more of like blues, and but there are cooler reds too, which have more of a blue tint, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So you can kind of see where it did that. I'm going to go in with a little bit more orange too, now that I've gone in with the darker tones, and fill this out.
Someone just asked, what's your favorite thing about Prismacolor?
That's a good question. I think I really love the quality of them. You know, everything that they make is high quality. And I think they do a good job of making fine art, you know, materials accessible. You know, where someone who isn't necessarily a professional can pick them up and get working and do really great work just because of the quality of them. I'm just going a little bit more dark in here, kind of going over the traditional shading now, and I can't help myself going in with what I like to do here. So this helps bring out the fur, really kind of molds it a little bit more. And if you want, I mean, you can obviously go in over your marker with color pencil too. And if you want to just even smooth it out, when I'm working a marker, I tend to like the texture of it and don't necessarily want to do that. But if you like doing that sort of thing, that's fine too. Because you know, you might not like all the streaks in there, and the color pencil will really help even that out. All right, I'm gonna actually go back now with the markers and do a little bit more of the face, just to kind of go through this technique a little bit more. So again, I've got the fur that I'm kind of mimicking. You know, obviously the forehead, there's fur sort of curling inward, and I'm basically using the strokes to get that effect to push it. And it might not seem like that big of a deal, but it definitely looks a lot cooler, in my opinion, when these strokes actually follow the form of whatever you're doing, as opposed to if I were just to go straight across over here and not have any sort of rhyme or reason to it. It almost brings it to life more.
Someone asked, do you have 3 favorite Prismacolor products by any chance?
Honestly, I mean, these Premier markers are amazing. And the colored pencils, Premier colored pencils, those are probably my 2 favorite. I don't know if I have a third yet, but those are the ones that I've been using for a long time. But I do like their pastels. I'm not big on pastels per se, but I do think that the pastels are really nice for what they are. But yeah, I would say those 3 in general. And then I know, like, I think the last class, someone was asking about how they could preserve what they're doing, because it more so is helpful when with color pencil or pastel, but you can use a fixative, and I think there may be a link at some point we might share, but any kind of workable fixative is great. I would just do it with ventilation, do it outside or something like that, but it helps protect the artwork. And then you can actually sometimes, depending on the nature of the fixative you get, you can go back in and rework things. All right, so something I didn't do on the actual finished color page, I'm gonna do right now just for fun, is add a little bit of lightness to this nose. So right now, like what I did previously, I'll show you, is I went full in, with the orange. But, this will be something you can do to add a little bit of depth with a lighter color. All right, so I've got some of my orange in there. And here, see, I'll try this Canary Yellow. I feel like that's probably the brightest one that we got. And I'm gonna test it out, excuse me, on the side here. All right, and then go in and just color in this nose like that. And obviously, depending on how you do it, you might want to start with your lighter color like I was doing earlier, and then go in darker. But this will help it pop even more. The more variation you can get in there, the better. Obviously, there's a certain point where it could be overkill, but I'm not too concerned about, okay, maybe I need more orange over there, over here. I could still go back in and change that. All right. So if I go back in with my orange, I can give this a little bit more shading on the sides. And even around the nose a little bit, under the nose. And then I'll go back in with this one, goldenrod, just for those lines to really make them jump out.
And John, we had somebody ask if you've illustrated a book.
Yes. So I did a children's book with another author. Her name is Maria Broom. If any of you have seen The Wire that used to be on HBO, she was Daniel's wife. I don't know if you haven't, then don't worry about it. But she's also a storyteller, and she basically took a story. It was an old African folk tale, and it's beautiful. Turned it into a children's book. So it's called The Village Bully. That is out there on the internet somewhere. And I've done some other comics and things like that, graphic novel. I did a graphic novel a while back, and I'm working on a few others as well.
And someone asked, do you have a preferred surface for under the paper that you're coloring on? Cardboard, wood, tabletop, anything like that?
Yeah, so I prefer, a wood table if I can, like if I'm not worried about the surface. But I think with the markers, especially, and depending on the paper you're using, right now I'm using thick paper, so I'm not really concerned with it bleeding through. But if you're using a thin paper, I would say go in, put some kind of cardboard underneath. Try not to do corrugated because you're going to get that texture. Maybe just something flat and smooth. Like even a notebook, or if anyone has albums and they're not concerned about the album covers getting damaged, you can use old album covers, that kind of thing. All right, put a little more shading in here. Go back to this side. So the reason I actually had the idea just now to go in with this lighter color is this. If any of you are using the Spanish orange right now, you'll notice that when you brush across, there's actually this beautiful yellow underneath that is left behind, which is very similar to the Canary Yellow. Just trying to keep it from bleeding over too much by going lightly around these edges and then going in wider when it comes to the bigger space. Obviously you could sit there if you wanted to and put in a little more detail with the fur like this. That is a personal preference. In this case, in this scenario, I'm just basically trying to fill it all in. So comes in handy to be able to change from detail to wide with the same tip.
We just had somebody ask, when you're working and you have to stop, do you notice a change in your concentration, or maybe something you were thinking of doing that after you stop, you change it when you come back?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially when I'm working on really detailed pieces. Um, I never, like, so for freelance or even with Newell, like I never send something right away when I'm finished. I give it like an hour if I can. Sometimes I don't have that opportunity or flexibility. I have to just send it right away. But I try to at least save some time to like let it sit there and go back to it, because as many as you probably know, when you're working on something for a long time, um, it changes your perspective of what you're doing. So it helps. I think it's really healthy just to get away from something for a little while and then go back to it.
We had somebody ask, how often do you think you replace or replenish your supplies?
Not that often. I would say, so color pencils I probably replace more than markers. These markers last a very long time. They hold a lot of ink. But it really depends, you know. So I might have some projects that I'm working on with one of these or the other, and I go through them a lot faster. But generally, both last a long time, but the markers especially. But also, you know, if any of you are interested in doing any kind of, you know, coloring line art yourself, um, you know, what I would suggest is just obviously going in with a light pencil. Like I know Prismacolor makes pencils of different hardness, but there are other places to get those too. But if you go with like a high H pencil, like a 4H or a 5H, and just, you know, draw very lightly what you're doing, and then go over with an ink pen. You can use an ink pen. Sumi ink is really nice to use with a brush because you can get just nice flowing lines like that. When they taper off at the end, and then just let that dry. And then again, too, it depends on whatever kind of ink you're using. If you find that the ink is runny, you can do what I did: scan it in and print it out, and you know, use the printout instead, so you don't have to worry about any of your lines running. If you notice, I'm kind of going in different orders around. So, you know, it's not necessarily, it's not necessary to kind of go, okay, now I've put this color in, I've got to put the next color in that order. You can always go back and change things. Okay. Go back in and color these lines over. Switch the tip.
We have somebody ask, what are some of your hobbies aside from coloring and drawing and designing?
Well, I actually do a bit of writing too. So the first graphic novel that I did was I wrote as well. It was quite a while ago, so I'm not necessarily as happy with it as I'd like to be now. But I have a few other projects that I'm working on that involve writing. Um, and also just, I mean, my wife and I just bought a house, so I like doing a little bit of house, you know, refinishing. Not a whole lot. There's a certain point I get to, and I need to call somebody and let them do it. But it's definitely a fun project to do, and I feel like, you know, especially with all of the information that's out there and how easy it is to figure out how to do things, it makes it much more accessible. So if you notice now, you can really see where this sort of painterly effect comes in as I'm going in with these sort of thinner strokes, still using the wide end, but painting with this, you can almost see like the strokes of hair on the lion's face. Which you can't really get with, you know, just a regular marker. because the end won't be as tapered. It just looks like a blunt stroke going across. So I'm going to pull this a little closer to the camera so you can see the detail. You know, just using the same color marker, you can get these effects. And the same goes for the, you know, the lighter yellow. I can do that too. Kind of go in and get a little bit more texture. Hold it up so you can see that too. Just depending on the quality of the video, I don't know if it's coming through, but you know, just using the same technique throughout, kind of pushing that fur texture. Pull that up closely so you can see. Just using that to build some shape around the lion's mouth. And two, sometimes with these markers, you know, it might seem like the ink might be running out, especially if you've just bought the marker. That is not the case. Sometimes if you just put the cap back on and give it a few minutes, it kind of restores it, or just turn it over because one side of the actual brush tip might be a little bit out of ink.
And I know we're coming up on time here shortly, so I did want to let everyone know that Raina shared in the chat where you can find the recording of this class tomorrow. And I will share again the links to all of John's websites and social media so you can see any of his other work any other time you'd like. And I can also share the link to his 101 class if you want to access that one as well.
Yeah, and I'm surprised that I got this far. I didn't know we would get the whole thing, the face finished really. You know, you can take it as far as you want to with your shading, because here, you know, I might want to go in and actually put a little bit of shadow underneath these corners, just so you can see where the hair pops out. And I'm going to go in just over those lines with the goldenrod color. So if you see, I'm putting a little bit of shadow in there to really make that pop.
And then we've had a few people ask if you could hold up or show the finished lion one last time. I'm trying to, I know I have a file of the finished one. So
Oh, sure. Yeah.
but wanted to have
If you don't, let me know. I'll send it over. But yeah, I can pull that up here. So this one, obviously, I didn't do the nose like that, but essentially the same technique. And I'll show it up close so you can see the different textures. The hair. So the hair, I put in a shading up at the top as it goes out, and even a little bit up here, because basically the hair is going to fold back, and it gives that sort of illusion that it's going backward. If I didn't have that shadow in there, it might just look like it's all sticking out straight up. The same for the sides too. Just kind of put a little bit of shadow on the outsides to make it look like it's flowing back. And yeah, I guess the last part I'll do is just this side of the face. If you guys want, I'd love to see what everyone has done so far. If you want to put it up in the chat, or not in the chat, just show it on your screen, and we can take a look at that and see what everybody's done. I wonder if anyone's tried different colors. That would be cool to see.
people are holding them up and they look really, really cool. They've done a good job.
I wonder if I can see. Oh, there we go. Oh, those look awesome. So I see Jenny Eeks. I love the light colors. Those are really nice. David Schlack, that one is really cool. It looks super graphic. Wow, you guys did a really nice job. Marsha Jackson, I don't know if it's a scream, but that looks like a pink or a purple. It's beautiful. Alexis, I don't want to mispronounce your name, Gilbalt. That's really cool. The bright yellow color is really nice. So yeah, I did this with like a smooth transition. Obviously, there isn't a lot of contrast here, but there are so many ways that you can do any kind of coloring page you're working on, depending on how you want it to be. You can make it super posterized, which using a lot of dark and light contrasting colors. And I definitely recommend trying blending any colors you want just to see what you can get out of it. It's nice to have something printed out too, or with just some room on the side, you can kind of mess around and see how these colors blend. But really nice stuff. So yeah, I guess that is pretty much it. I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, that's it. Everyone's saying thank you so much, John.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Great
Thanks
job,
for
so thank you.
watching along. Definitely, connect on any of those social media channels in some way. I'd love to see these when they're finished. It would be really great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.